Thank you so much for being here. I'm delighted to welcome you to the Capstone workshop for the Humility and Conviction in Public Life project. Over the next couple days, we'll have a chance to learn about each other's work, talk to each other, dialogue with one another, talk about dialoguing, and hopefully move these ideas forward. So what I'd like to do to start out is to just give you a general overview, a bird's eye view, so to speak, of this project. And I thought I might begin with a few remarks about its origin story. So, about four and a half years ago now, Brendan Kane, my friend and co-PI on the project, initiated this, what turned out to be about a year-long process of obtaining funding for this project idea we had on renewing public discourse in democracy. At the time, we weren't sure about the scope of it. And during that period, we were in discussions with the John Templeton Foundation, and Michael Murray came to visit us. He was the vice president of the foundation, and he was coming to check us out. And so Brendan and I met with him, and during that meeting, you'll remember, he said to us somewhat fatefully, I think as he later discovered, to think big, boys. Be ambitious. So $8 million later, we realized that we had thought big about this project. And what I'm going to try to do today is to guide you through some of the parts of the project that, that you may or may not know about, and give you a sense of what it's all been about from, as I said, the bird's eye point of view. Now, when we first started out on this project, and I would tell people that I was involved in a project that concerned humility and arrogance and politics. This was in 2015. And at that time, people thought, that's weird. Like, why would anybody think that concepts like humility and arrogance would have anything to do with our political scene? Sadly, it's turned out to be more relevant than we had thought it would be. And that's been both good and bad, as many people in this room know. So the guiding question of our project is, how can we balance our deepest convictions with humility? But the real research focus of the project has been a little bit more specific than that, still very broad. How might intellectual humility promote healthier and more meaningful discourse about various pressing issues in science and morality and religion? Again, a research focus, that's what we called it in our grant, but still very broad. And the mission was also very broad, to apply and engage the public with that research for the purpose of cultural change. So part of what I'm going to do today is to talk about the research and also talk about our initiatives to apply that research for the purpose of cultural change. I'm not going to talk about any of that in detail because that's what your job is throughout the next couple days. But I wanted to give you this taste. Going back to the guiding question, how we balance our humility, our deepest convictions with a sense of humility. Of course, the kind of humility that we have in mind is intellectual humility. And many of you have spent the last few years working on projects specifically about that concept and its role in intellectual humility. But the project is also, in a sense, a pretty big machine. And as this slide, hopefully it's hard to even see, this is up on our website, but for those of you in the back, you can see there, this is the extent of the project and its ways of trying to take your research on intellectual humility and connect it to various things. We have the research and all the various things, I'll talk about that in a minute, our educational outreach initiatives, and our public initiatives and media communication initiatives, all of which we're trying to work together to reinforce the idea and the mission that we have of taking this research and applying it for cultural change. So on the research end of things, that included what we called our global research teams, the 10 teams that won awards from the RFP competition, which, by the way, was extraordinarily competitive. We only awarded 7%, so there was 7% chance of success on that. So those, I mean, that's a fairly rigorous competition. So we were very happy with, we had the amount of response worldwide. We had cities from across the world, actually cities applying, as well as researchers and cities together. Here's all of you, or many of you up there, your mug shots. I'm not going to say much about this or anything more, because you will be talking about your own research in the next couple days as you discuss the results of your research over the last couple of years. In addition, though, to our global research teams, we also had Yukon research teams. Richard Wilson, who's going to, for example, is there, who's worked on hate speech. He's going to chair the first session. Many of the rest of you as well have had projects funded by the Humanities Institute on public discourse and on humility and conviction, and some of you are up there now. And again, you'll have a chance to talk about, some of you with your, I hope, about your research with the global research teams over the next couple days. We also had 3 working groups on campus. One was concerned with what we call social epistemology. That's the sewing circle led by Teresa Allen. The Initiative on Campus Dialogues, our biggest and in many ways, most successful working group, led by Brendan Kane and Dana Miranda, who's pictured there. And Intellectual Humility and Education Working Group, led by Manuela Wagner. And those working groups will continue their work past today into the future as they try to move our ideas forward. We also held, during the project, depending on how you count, 6 to 8 workshops, academic conferences, essentially. I say depends on how you count, because it depends on which part of the project funded them. But quite a lot of academic conferences. You see some of the leaders of those conferences pictured here. And we also had a bunch of research fellows, people from both democracy practitioners and academic leaders who came and spent a semester or a year with us to pursue their research. And some of those were residential fellows at the Institute from outside, and some were joining us from UConn itself. Again, just trying to give you a scope. The Humanities Institute in general has a fellowship program that functions like this, much like an Institute of Advanced Study, and it was great to have people here that were just dedicated to working on the project. We had some postdocs, Casey Rebecca Johnson and Sandra Sirota. Casey's now at the University of Idaho, and Sandra's just taken up a position at the UN. And the result of all that research was over 200 publications in the popular and technical press, including presses like Nature, Human Behavior, Scientific American, Mind, Personality and Individual Differences, the New York Times, Washington Post, and many more. I'm not going to list them all, but some of them are still in press, but we were amazed and so happy with all the research that people in this room have produced. So what did we learn from that research? Well, what we learned from the research is going to depend on, in the eyes of the researcher, I suppose. But I wanted to pause for a few minutes in my blitzkrieg overview and say a little bit about some of the things that I've brought away from the project. So, one of the things that this is risky to say to a bunch of researchers who work on intellectual humility, that there's an emerging consensus, but I'm going to say it anyway because I've got the clicker. So, I think there's been an emerging consensus about what intellectual humility is as a concept. That consensus, I think, is starting to see it as a concept that involves 2 parts. One part is self-regarding, and another part is other-regarding. Now, not everybody's going to agree with how these parts relate or whether both of these parts are actually part of the concept or a part of a larger, what we might call, conception or theory. In other words, not everybody's going to agree that these aspects that I'm going to discuss are packed into the idea itself as opposed to surrounding the idea. And not everybody's going to agree which one of these aspects is the most important. But I think increasingly people tend to think that there are these two aspects are central. First, owning your biases and cognitive limitations. Heather Baddeley is here in the room. She's worked hard to promote that idea. Many of you have used her ideas in your studies. This idea of that intellectual humility involves not just acknowledging that you don't know what you don't know, but also owning, that is, taking on, accepting, committing to the fact that you have certain biases and cognitive limitations. But the second part, I think, is in my own mind, equally important, and that is the idea that intellectual humility also involves a commitment to the improvability of your worldview from the evidence and experience of other people. A commitment to the improvability of your worldview from the evidence and experience of other people. That's an other regarding aspect of this psychosocial attitude. And I do, following Alessandro Tanazzini myself, think of it as an attitude. Some of you think of it as a trait and study it as a trait. We can debate and talk about that over the next couple days. But I think of it as a psychosocial attitude myself. And part of that attitude involves being willing to take on the evidence and testimony of others when it's relevant. So I think that one of the things that I've learned from reading all of your work is that this is a really interesting attitude that has both this, as I said, self-regarding and other-regarding aspect. We've also learning that it's both a political and epistemic value. It has value for democracy insofar as it's promoted in our citizens, at least some of the time. It seems to have value for those who participate in dialogue. We'll learn about some of that. But it also has value for inquiry, for scientific inquiry. But, and this is an important thing that I think has definitely emerged in this project, is that its value is pro tanto. It's not all things considered valuable. As many of you might remark over the next couple days, intellectual humility, in other words, it matters, but much like honesty, it's a good policy. But when the Nazis are at your door, asking if you're hiding Jews, for example, honesty is not the policy you should follow. And when the Nazis confront you, intellectual humility might not be the appropriate attitude to have to their ideas. So that's an interesting thing that's come out of the project, I think. Not everybody's going to agree on that, but again, it's a thing that came out, our very first workshop, Michael Morrell hosted on public reason and intellectual humility. It happened the day after the election. People were not in a humble frame of mind. Let me tell you. Okay? So why this matters? Democracies, I think, function less well to the degree that citizens lack these motivationally thick commitments to a vision of the good life. We need our citizens to have convictions, to stand up for what they believe in, to have views about what matters, but we also want them to have a willingness to listen and learn from those with differing commitments. And thus, I think dogmatic intellectual arrogance, on the other hand, the opposite of intellectual humility, is particularly harmful to dialogue and democracy, and can lead to a politics, I think, of not just us versus them, but us over them. And yes, that's a promo in a very non-humble way for my own contribution to the project, subtly displayed, tastefully in the corner. Know-It-All Society, which comes out next fall. And now I want to switch gears and turn to a cultural change aspect of the project. What did we do to engage the public? And again, many of you are going to talk about this in detail, so I'm just going to hit the highlights so you see the overview. Brendan Kane was in charge of this aspect of the project, and he'll have a chance to talk in detail about the nationally recognized model for dialogue with communities that he's created called Encounters, along with a number of other people here. He'll be talking about that later today. And there we see some of the folks involved in that project. It's been a really exciting ride watching that develop and flourish here in Hartford and now be exported or start to be exported nationwide. We sponsored a MOOC, Mitch Green, professor of philosophy here. We work with the University of Edinburgh and Coursera, and we have people taking the MOOC from over 40 countries. It's called Know Thyself, which is a great way of sort of getting at the self-knowledge aspect of intellectual humility. We hosted 3 public forums, one of which was last night with W. Kamau Bell and Kelly Corrigan. This is me with Krista Tippett and David Brooks down in Washington, D.C. Our initial public forum. That was at the Folger Shakespeare Library right across from the Capitol. And that was a really great way to launch the event. We also engaged high school teachers. We had 3 summer institutes for high school teachers hosted here at the University of Connecticut with Mickey McEllier, Glenn Matoma, and again Mitch Green. These brought high school teachers from around the state and sometimes out of state to engage with the ideas of intellectual humility and figure out how to incorporate some of your research into their classrooms. One of the things that's really hard to do in high school, of course, in college, we're all used to just talking about divisive issues all the time with our students. That's what we do, often, many of us. High school, that's a little bit more complicated for all sorts of reasons I probably don't need to explain. And so it was really great to bring educational experts together with high school teachers to talk about how to incorporate dialogue and intellectual humility in their syllabi. You'll hear about later today, we hosted an internationally followed podcast. It's been very successful, led by Robert Tulise and Matt Borigula. And you'll have a chance to hear about that later today. That's Why We Argue. I hope many of you were on the program. I hope you have a chance to listen to that. It's been a smashing success. And I just want to end by saying thank you to all the people here. I'll have a chance to say that again at dinner. But the whole team here, pictured here, people like Anka Finger and Joanne Wade and Nathan, who's been organizing this entire thing, Nasia and Megan, and everyone else all the graduate students who've worked so hard to make this event possible. I really appreciate your work. Just a few housekeeping notes. The restrooms, the women's room is over on this side. If you leave and exit to your right, you'll see it. And then the men's room is over to your left. The Institute itself, if you want to take a look, and you're welcome to, go in and check out the Institute. There are areas to lounge and get more coffee and, hang out. That's located just in that direction on the other side of the building, takes up the other side of the building, and you're welcome to visit that space as well. And with that, I'm going to welcome up the first panel. So Professor Richard Wilson is going to chair it. This is the Goldstein Professor of Human Rights here, and we're delighted to welcome him and the rest of you here. So thank you very much for being here.